The merciless Arizona sun beat down on the cracked earth, like hammer blows against an anvil, each ray of light carrying death in its intensity. Old Tom Mackenzie lay motionless against a twisted Joshua tree, his weathered lips split and bleeding from 3 days without water. His once proud frame, hardened by 40 years of ranching in the harsh Sonoran desert, now seemed fragile as dried parchment in the unforgiving heat. Tom's clouded eyes gazed across the endless expanse of sand and rock that stretched toward the distant mountains, their purple peaks shimmering like mirages in the superheated air. Buzzards circled overhead with patient certainty, their shadows providing the only relief from the blazing sun. The old rancher knew they were waiting for him to stop moving entirely, and he suspected that moment was drawing near. 3 days earlier, Tom had been riding the boundaries of his ranch, checking water holes and looking for strays that might have wandered into the desert in search of better grazing. It was routine work that he had performed thousands of times over the decades, but this trip had gone catastrophically wrong. His horse had stepped into a hidden prairie dog hole and broken its leg, forcing Tom to put the faithful animal out of its misery with a heavy heart. That should have been manageable. Tom was only 15 miles from his ranch house, a long walk, but certainly survivable for a man who had spent his entire adult life in the desert. What he hadn't counted on was the ambush that waited for him at Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage that provided the only practical route back to civilization. The Carrillo brothers had been waiting for him there, their faces hidden behind bandanas, but their voices unmistakable. Eduardo and Miguel Carrillo had been trying to force Tom off his land for months, making increasingly aggressive offers to purchase his ranch for a fraction of its true value. When Tom had continued to refuse their demands, they had apparently decided to take more direct action. "Old man," Eduardo had called out from behind a boulder, "you should have taken our generous offer when you had the chance." Tom had reached for his rifle, but Miguel's shot from the opposite rim of the canyon had shattered his right shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle and sending his weapon clattering across the rocks. The pain had been immediate and overwhelming, but what followed was far worse. "We're not going to kill you, Mackenzie," Miguel had announced with cold satisfaction. "That would bring too much attention from the law. Instead, we're going to let the desert do our work for us." The brothers had taken his horse, his weapons, and most crucially, his water. They had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a shattered shoulder that screamed with agony every time he tried to move. Then they had ridden away, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls like the cries of demons. Tom had managed to crawl several miles through the desert over the past 3 days, driven by pure, stubborn determination and the faint hope that he might reach one of the seasonal water holes before his strength gave out entirely. But the nearest reliable source was still at least 5 miles away, and he could no longer feel his legs beneath him. The hallucinations had started on the 2nd day. At first they were simple things, his late wife Sarah calling his name from across impossible distances, or the sound of water trickling over rocks where no water existed. By the 3rd day, the visions had become more elaborate and cruel. He saw his ranch house shimmering in the distance, its windmill turning lazily in a breeze he couldn't feel, offering the promise of cool, life-giving water from the well he had dug with his own hands 30 years earlier. Tom's cracked lips moved silently as he tried to pray, but no sound emerged from his parched throat. He had never been a particularly religious man, but facing death in the vastness of the desert had a way of making even the most skeptical consider the possibility of divine intervention. Unfortunately, God seemed to have other priorities at the moment. The old rancher's mind drifted back to better times, when his ranch had been thriving, and Sarah had been alive to share his dreams of building something lasting in this harsh but beautiful land. They had never been blessed with children, a source of ongoing sadness that had only deepened after Sarah's death from fever 5 years earlier. Now, with no family to mourn him and no heirs to inherit his legacy, Tom faced the grim reality that his death would likely go unnoticed for weeks or even months. as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Tom heard something that made him question his sanity once again. It sounded like singing, a high, clear voice carrying a familiar melody across the desolate landscape. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The song grew closer, and Tom forced his eyes open to see a small figure moving across the desert toward him. At first, he assumed it was another hallucination, perhaps inspired by his childhood memories of church services and Sunday school. But the figure continued to approach, and Tom gradually realized that this was no vision conjured by his dying brain. The singer was a boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, leading a burro laden with supplies across the trackless waste. The child moved with the confidence of someone who knew the desert intimately, stepping carefully around hidden hazards and following paths that were invisible to untrained eyes. Most remarkably, he seemed to be heading directly toward Tom's location, as if he had known exactly where to find the dying rancher. "Mister?" The boy called out as he drew closer. "Mister, are you hurt?" Tom tried to respond but managed only a weak croak. The effort sent waves of pain through his damaged throat, but it was enough to confirm for the boy that he was still alive. The child approached carefully, his dark eyes taking in Tom's condition with a maturity that seemed far beyond his apparent age. He was clearly of Mexican descent, with sun-darkened skin and black hair that stuck out from beneath a battered straw hat. His clothes were patched and faded but clean, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that immediately impressed the dying rancher. "Don't try to talk, senor," the boy said gently. "I can see you need water." The child quickly unpacked a clay water jug from his burro's pack and brought it to Tom's lips. The first drops of liquid to touch the rancher's mouth in 3 days felt like a miracle, cool and sweet and life-giving beyond description. The boy was careful not to give him too much too quickly, allowing small sips that wouldn't shock his system. "My name is Miguel Santos," the boy said quietly as Tom drank. "Oh, what happened to you, senor?" Tom managed to whisper a few words about the ambush and his abandonment, though speaking was still painful and difficult. Miguel listened carefully, his young face growing grave as he understood the severity of the situation. "The Carrillo brothers," Miguel said with obvious distaste. "I know of them. They are bad men who cause much trouble for honest people." The boy's hands were gentle but sure as he examined Tom's wounded shoulder and assessed his overall condition. Despite his youth, Miguel clearly possessed considerable knowledge about desert survival and basic medical care. "You are very sick, senor," Miguel observed. "But I think you will live if we can get you to help quickly. My grandmother lives not far from here, and she knows much about healing." Tom felt tears of gratitude rolling down his cheeks as he realized that this mysterious boy might actually be able to save his life. But even as hope began to stir in his chest, practical concerns crowded his mind. How had Miguel known where to find him? What was a child doing alone in this deadly wilderness? And most importantly, would they be able to reach safety before Tom's injuries and dehydration claimed his life? Miguel Santos worked with the practiced efficiency of someone far older than his 13 years, his small hands steady as he carefully cleaned Tom's infected shoulder wound with precious water from his supplies. The old rancher gritted his teeth against the pain, marveling at the boy's knowledge of desert medicine and survival techniques. "My grandmother taught me about treating wounds," Miguel explained as he worked. "She learned from her grandmother, who was a curandera, a healer. The knowledge passes down through the families." Tom studied the boy's face as Miguel applied a poultice made from desert plants to the gunshot wound. There was something almost otherworldly about the child's presence in this desolate place, as if he had appeared from nowhere specifically to save a dying man. "How did you find me?" Tom managed to whisper through his damaged throat. Miguel's dark eyes met Tom's with startling directness. "I was following the buzzards, senor. They have been circling this area for 2 days. I knew something was wrong, so I came to investigate. The explanation was logical, but something in Miguel's manner suggested there was more to the story. The boy possessed an almost supernatural understanding of the desert's rhythms and secrets, moving through the harsh landscape as if it were his natural element, rather than a hostile environment that killed the unprepared. As Miguel continued his ministrations, he shared his own story. He was an orphan who had been living with his grandmother in a small settlement called Esperanza, hidden deep in the mountains about 20 miles south of Tom's ranch. The village was inhabited primarily by Mexican families who had been displaced by various conflicts and land disputes over the years. "My parents died when I was 7, Miguel explained matter-of-factly. "Cholera took many people that year. My grandmother, Esperanza Delgado, took me in even though she had very little herself." The boy's grandmother had taught him to survive in the desert by understanding its moods and seasons, learning which plants provided water and medicine, and how to read the subtle signs that warned of danger or pointed toward safety. Miguel had become the village's primary scout and forager, venturing far into the wilderness to gather supplies and information. "Why were you so far from home?" Tom asked, his voice growing slightly stronger as the water and medical attention began to take effect. Miguel hesitated before answering, as if weighing how much truth to reveal. "There have been bad men asking questions in Esperanza, senor. Been looking for information about water rights and land ownership. My grandmother sent me to explore the area and see what these men might be planning." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place in Tom's mind. The Carrillo brothers' interest in his ranch wasn't just about the land itself, but about something more valuable: water rights. Tom's property contained several year-round springs and sat astride an underground river that provided reliable water even during the worst droughts. Control of that water would give someone tremendous power over the entire region. "The Carrillo brothers," Tom said. "They're the ones asking questions in your village?" Miguel nodded grimly. "They came with maps and legal papers, claiming they owned much of the land around here. They wanted to know about water sources, about who lived where, about which families might be willing to sell their claims." The boy's voice took on an edge of anger that seemed incongruous with his gentle demeanor. "They threatened my grandmother when she wouldn't tell them what they wanted to know. Said that people who didn't cooperate might find themselves having accidents in the desert." Tom felt a surge of protective rage at the thought of grown men threatening an elderly woman and her orphaned grandson. Despite his weakened condition, the old rancher's hands clenched into fists as he imagined what he would do to the Carrillo brothers when he recovered. Miguel seemed to sense Tom's anger and placed a calming hand on the older man's uninjured arm. "Anger will not help us now, senor. We must focus on getting you to safety so you can heal and fight another day." The boy's wisdom and maturity continued to astonish Tom. Most adults would have been consumed with thoughts of revenge after suffering such treatment. But Miguel approached their situation with a clarity of purpose that was both admirable and somewhat mystical. As the afternoon wore on, Miguel prepared for the dangerous journey ahead. He had concluded that Tom was too weak to travel the full distance to Esperanza, but there was an abandoned mine shaft about 8 miles to the south that would provide shelter and access to underground water. If they could reach that refuge, Tom would have a chance to recover enough strength for the longer journey to proper medical care. "Can you ride, senor?" Miguel asked, gesturing toward his burro. "Estrella is strong, but you are a big man." Tom looked at the small donkey dubiously. "I don't think that's going to work, son. I'll have to walk." "Then we will walk together," Miguel said simply. "But we must start soon, while the sun is not so high." The boy helped Tom to his feet, supporting his weight as the rancher's weakened legs struggled to bear him upright. The first few steps were agony, but gradually Tom's circulation began to improve and his muscles remembered how to function. They began their slow progress across the desert, Miguel leading his burro while supporting Tom with his other arm. The boy seemed to know exactly where he was going, despite the apparent lack of landmarks. following invisible trails and avoiding hazards with uncanny precision. As they walked, Miguel shared more stories about his life in Esperanza and the people who had taken refuge there. Tom learned about families who had lost their land to legal manipulations, honest farmers driven out by violence, and children orphaned by the ongoing conflicts that plagued the borderlands. "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman," Tom observed during one of their frequent rest stops. Miguel's face lit up with obvious love and respect. "She is the strongest person I know, senor. When others wanted to give up and move away, she convinced them to stay and build something good in Esperanza. She says that running from trouble just means the trouble will follow you wherever you go." The boy's words resonated deeply with Tom, who had spent his entire adult life fighting to build something lasting in the harsh desert. The old rancher began to understand that he and these Mexican refugees shared more common ground than their different backgrounds might suggest. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Miguel pointed toward a distant ridge. "The mine is just beyond that rise, senor. We should reach it before full darkness." Tom's legs felt like rubber, and his wounded shoulder throbbed with every step, but the prospect of shelter and water gave him renewed strength. More importantly, the boy's unwavering confidence and support had rekindled something in the old rancher that he had thought was lost forever: hope for the future. "Miguel," Tom said as they continued their painful progress, "when this is over, when I'm back on my feet, I want to help your grandmother and your people. The Carrillo brothers have made enemies of us all." The boy smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Tom had seen on his young face. "She will like you, senor. My grandmother always says that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who have nothing to offer him in return." As they crested the final hill and saw the abandoned mine shaft below them, Tom realized that Miguel Santos had already given him something invaluable: his life, his hope, and most importantly, his trust. Now it was time for the old rancher to prove himself worthy of such precious gifts. Will they reach the mine in time? And what dangers await them in the abandoned tunnels? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how this incredible desert survival story unfolds. The abandoned silver mine gaped before them, like a mouth in the mountainside, its entrance partially collapsed, but still passable for anyone desperate enough to seek shelter in its depths. Tom Mackenzie leaned heavily on Miguel Santos as they approached the dark opening, his strength nearly spent after their grueling 8-mile trek across the desert floor. "There is good water inside, senor," Miguel assured him, noting Tom's apprehensive expression. "The miners dug deep enough to reach the underground river. The water is clean and cold, even in the hottest summer." The boy led Tom carefully through the rubble-strewn entrance, his small form moving with the confidence of someone who had explored these tunnels before. The temperature dropped noticeably as they moved away from the desert heat, and Tom felt some of his strength returning in the cooler air. About 50 yards into the mine, Miguel stopped beside a natural pool of crystal-clear water that reflected the faint light filtering in from the entrance. The sound of gently moving water was like music to Tom's ears after 3 days of desperate thirst. "Drink slowly," Miguel cautioned as Tom knelt beside the pool. "Your body needs time to remember how to use water properly." Tom followed the boy's advice, though every instinct screamed at him to plunge his face into the life-giving liquid and drink until he could hold no more. The water was indeed cool and pure, tasting better than the finest wine he had ever sampled. As Tom drank and bathed his fevered face, Miguel unpacked supplies from his burrow and began preparing a simple meal from dried meat, flatbread, and desert fruits. The boy worked with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to making the most of limited resources. "How did you know about this place?" Tom asked as his strength slowly returned. Miguel smiled mysteriously. "My grandmother explored these mountains as a young woman before the mines were dug. She knew about the underground river and told the miners where to dig to find the best water. When the silver played out and the miners left, she made sure our people remembered where the water could be found. The boy's words carried deeper implications that Tom was beginning to understand. The hidden village of Esperanza and its inhabitants weren't just refugees seeking shelter in the desert. They were guardians of knowledge that could mean survival or death in this harsh land. As night fell and the desert air began to cool, Miguel built a small fire near the pool, using dried wood he had brought in his pack. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the mine walls, creating an almost magical atmosphere in the underground chamber. "Tell me about your ranch, Senor," Miguel said as they shared their simple meal. "What makes it so important that bad men would leave you to die for it?" Tom considered how to explain the complex web of water rights, land ownership, and regional politics that had made him a target. "My property sits on top of an underground river system that feeds several major springs," he began. "During drought years, my ranch is sometimes the only reliable source of water for 50 miles in any direction." Miguel nodded with understanding beyond his years. "And whoever controls the water controls everything else." "Exactly. The Carrillo brothers want to buy up all the land with water rights, then charge whatever they want for access. They could force entire communities to abandon their homes or pay impossible prices just to survive." The boy stared into the fire for several moments, clearly processing the implications of what Tom had revealed. "Including Esperanza," he said finally. "Including Esperanza," Tom confirmed. "Your grandmother was smart to send you out scouting. The Carrillos are planning something big, and communities like yours will be the first to suffer if they succeed." Miguel stood and walked to the pool, kneeling beside the water as if seeking wisdom from its depths. "There is something I must tell you, Senor. Something I have not shared with anyone except my grandmother." Tom waited patiently as the boy struggled with whatever secret he was preparing to reveal. "I know where there is more water," Miguel said finally. "Much more water. Enough to supply many communities and make it impossible for anyone to control all the sources in this region." The old rancher felt his heart rate increase as he realized the significance of Miguel's words. "Where?" Miguel pointed deeper into the mine tunnel. "Beyond where the miners stopped digging, there is a vast underground lake. My grandmother discovered it years ago when she was exploring the cave system. The water is clean and pure, and there is so much that it could supply a dozen settlements like Esperanza. Why hasn't anyone developed it?" "Because it would require much money and work to make it accessible," Miguel explained. "And because my grandmother believes that such resources should belong to the people who need them, not to rich men who would use them to gain power over others." Tom's mind raced with possibilities. An underground lake of that magnitude would completely change the balance of power in the region, making it impossible for the Carrillo brothers or anyone else to monopolize water access. "Can you show me this lake?" Tom asked. Miguel nodded. "When you are stronger, Senor. But it is a difficult journey, even for someone in good health." They spent the next 3 days in the mine, while Tom's strength slowly returned and his wounded shoulder began to heal. Miguel proved to be an excellent nurse and companion, sharing stories of his life in Esperanza and demonstrating an extensive knowledge of desert lore passed down through generations of his grandmother's people. On the 4th morning, Miguel declared that Tom was well enough for the journey to see the underground lake. They ventured deeper into the mine system, following passages that had been carved by water over countless centuries. The air grew cooler and more humid as they descended, carrying the unmistakable scent of a large body of water. The tunnel finally opened into a vast cavern that took Tom's breath away. The underground lake stretched beyond the range of their torchlight, its surface perfectly still and reflecting their flames like a mirror. The sound of water dripping from stalactites created a gentle musical rhythm that echoed through the enormous space. "Dios mío," Tom whispered, using one of the few Spanish phrases he knew. "This is incredible." Miguel beamed with pride at Tom's reaction. My grandmother says this lake has been here since before the first people came to this land. She calls it El Corazón del Desierto, the heart of the desert. Tom walked to the edge of the lake and knelt to taste the water. It was pure and sweet, without the mineral taste that characterized many underground sources. This could supply water to thousands of people, he said in amazement. That is what my grandmother believes, Miguel agreed. But she also knows that greedy men would try to claim it for themselves if they knew it existed. Tom looked at the boy with new understanding. That's why she sent you to scout the area. She's trying to figure out how to protect this resource from people like the Carrillo brothers. Miguel nodded solemnly. She believes that the only way to keep it safe is to make sure it belongs to all the people who need it, not to any one person or group. The old rancher stood and placed his hand on Miguel's shoulder, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had been shared with him. Son, I think your grandmother and I need to have a conversation. As they made their way back through the tunnels toward the surface, Tom's mind was already working on plans that could benefit everyone involved. His ranch property, combined with access to the underground lake, could become the foundation for a cooperative water management system that would serve the entire region while protecting it from exploitation. When they emerged into the desert sunlight, Tom felt stronger than he had in years. The physical healing was important, but more significant was the sense of purpose that Miguel and his grandmother's vision had given him. He was no longer just a lonely old rancher trying to hold onto his land. He was part of something larger and more meaningful. Miguel, Tom said, as they prepared for the journey to Esperanza, I want you to know that finding you in that desert was the best thing that's happened to me in years. You didn't just save my life, son. You gave me back my reason for living. The boy smiled, with the wisdom of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unlikely places. My grandmother always says that water finds its way to where it's needed most, senor. Maybe the same is true for people. As they set off across the desert toward the hidden village of Esperanza, Tom Mackenzie realized that his encounter with death had actually been the beginning of new life, not just for himself, but potentially for everyone who called the harsh but beautiful Sonoran desert home. The old rancher had found more than water in the wasteland. He had discovered hope, purpose, and the family he never knew he was searching for. What an incredible journey of survival, hope, and discovery. Tom found not just water, but a new family and purpose in life. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of survival and humanity in the Old West. Share this inspiring story with anyone who believes in the power of hope and human kindness. What was your favorite moment in this desert adventure? Let us know in the comments below.